Not one that has, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids, but one at last count who had 12 and still probably that aren't even mentioned in the scripture. This is a fellow by the name of Jacob. And we're going to hear about his real encounter with the real God. And it's a passage that comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 32. And I'd like to read it for us this morning, beginning with verse 22. These words. So that night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jacob. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. This summer, we're taking a look at people in Scripture who meet the real God. Now, lots of people in our world today are looking for some kind of a spiritual connection or a deeper spiritual life. But let me suggest that when we meet these people in Scripture, it's not probably what a lot of the people who are looking for those generic spiritual experiences are really looking for. Lots of folks I talk to that are interested in a kind of a generic spirituality talk about wanting to get centered. But when you look at what happens to Jacob here, when he meets the real God, he is not centered. He's knocked off balance. Lots of folks who are looking for some kind of a spiritual connection are searching for a sense of peace. But when Jacob meets that real God on that brook, he's not finding peace. He's rattled. He's thrown to the ground and crippled for life. And yet, this night forever changed Jacob. It was a life-altering moment for him. That night changed because on that night, as he wrestled with God, he met the real God. So let me just begin with a question. And the question is, how do you know you don't just believe in God, but you've actually met the real God? How can you tell that you've actually had a life-altering kind of encounter with God? Well, from Jacob's encounter, we find 3 marks of a life-changing encounter with the real God. Now, before we get into it, we probably need a little background here. Jacob, as you might know, was one of 2 sons, and from the very beginning, he learned that the way to get ahead was to lie and to cheat. And because of the fact that he lied and cheated his brother Esau out of his inheritance, Jacob was forced to flee for his life to a distant country where he himself was deceived, but that's a whole nother story. But as this chapter here opens, Jacob has decided he's going to go home again. with his family and his wives and his servants, his flock and his livestock, he begins to head back to where he had been born. But when he begins heading back, he hears that the brother that he had cheated so many years prior was heading straight toward him with a band of armed 400 men. So Jacob is terrified that his brother is about to fulfill the promise to kill him. But Jacob has a plan. Jacob always had a plan. And his plan is, first, he sends a large herd of livestock to his brother and says to him, "This is a gift from your humble servant, your brother Jacob." And the second thing he does is he divides the rest of his entourage and sends each of those parts into different directions, so that if Esau ends up chasing down one part of the entourage, one part of what he has and owns and his family, at least he'll have the other part to remain and he won't lose everything. And so the scene that we just read opens with Jacob having sent everything and everyone away from him, and it is night now. Verse 24. So Jacob was left alone. And I want to suggest that's the condition. Away from your family, away from the community that you're a part of, away from the possessions that you have. That is where Jacob has this spiritual encounter. Because you see, if you are going to meet the real God, you're going to have to meet him yourself. You've got to meet him personally, and probably, almost certainly, you have to meet him in some sense alone. Some of us grew up in churches that we have loved all of our lives, and this is certainly one of them for me. But one of the things that troubles me at times is that I'll talk to someone that's moved away, moved out of town, gotten a new job. And then I'll talk with them a year or two later as they come back to visit. And I'll say, "Tell me about the church you're now attending." And far too often sheepishly, they will say, "Well, I really haven't found a church. And I'm not really, frankly, going to church anymore." And the reason that's troubling for me is that it gives me the sense that, well, was your faith all about attending church? Was your whole spiritual identity and your growth as a person and as a Christian dependent solely on finding a church you like the best? It makes me wonder if their faith was more, cultural, a family kind of a thing, than a personal kind of a thing. But see, if you're going to meet the real God, you have to meet him yourself. You've got to meet him in the moments of being alone, and you've got to meet him personally. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm all for groups. I'm all for worshiping together and doing life together. But it's possible to just be part of a group and not to meet God yourself in the interior of your life, personally, alone in your own heart. Because real faith in the real God, is more than just a group thing. It's more than a family thing. It's more than a community thing or a cultural thing or a heritage of your family. Real faith is a personal thing. If you want to meet the real God, you're going to have to meet him separate, distinct from your family, personally. And let me just say something for the dads here this morning. Good for you that you're here, and good for you if you brought your kids here today. Good for you if you brought your kids and let them come to Vacations Bible School and be part of our children's ministry around here. But if you think that your only role spiritually in their life is to get them to church, you're going to be sadly disappointed when they never finally realize that faith isn't just about attending a corporate service. Faith is about a personal friendship with Jesus. And one of the things, Dad, as a dad, you need to not just talk about did you go to church and what did you learn in Sunday school, but how are you, or what are you learning about the fact that God wants to love you and let you be a part of his world? And how are you talking to him and helping them to understand what it means to pray and develop that kind of personal relationship? We had lots of kids come to faith this week, but if they don't have that faith nurtured in their home, it's going to be a disappointment not only to you, but to them as well. And so when it comes to meeting God, we have to meet him personally. And that's what happens here to Jacob. Verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him. Now, what's this about? A man wrestles with him. Well, something happened to Jacob that night. Someone bothered him. Someone interrupted him. Someone jumped him. Someone interfered with him. And that's how you know that you are beginning to meet the real God. Because when you begin to meet the real God, he begins to intrude on how you actually live your life, how you actually live your private life. You see, you can believe in God, you can follow God, you can obey God, but when you meet the real God, he starts messing with you. He starts interrupting your plans and bothering you, getting into your crawl, and you find yourself in a wrestling match at times with him. I mean, we all love the idea that God is always on call, as he is when we get into a jam, but we're just not so sure we want him to be interfering with how we live our private lives. But one evidence that you're meeting and beginning to meet the real God is he starts to mess with you and interfere in your life. He begins to intrude in the personal aspects of your life. He begins to ask you to do things with your time you really didn't want to particularly do a year before, or to give some money to something that you weren't particularly ready to give money toward 2 years prior. Because when you meet the real God, he starts interfering. In fact, that's the first blank in the outline. And if you want to really meet the real God, you can't just want him to inspire you or to inform you. When you meet the real God, you want him to bless you. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's go back to the story. So Jacob has this brother by the name of Esau. In fact, they're twins, the two of them. And their father, Isaac, loved Esau the best. He doted on Esau. He favored Esau. And that favoritism that he showed toward the oldest, well, it just wounded Jacob. And it wounds any child when a parent shows such blatant favoritism toward one child over the others. Did you hear that, Dad? So as these two brothers are getting older, Isaac, the father, decides it's time for him to give his firstborn son the birthright blessing. Now, the birthright blessing went to the firstborn, and basically it was the lion's share of the inheritance. And giving that blessing to the firstborn involved bringing that son in, placing your hands on that son, and then offering this ritual blessing. But when Jacob got wind that his old and blind father was about to bless Esau, he, along with his mother's assistants, dressed himself up to feel and to even smell like his older brother. He posed as his older brother so that his father would pronounce the blessing on him, thinking that it was in fact Esau. Jacob deceived his father. And when Isaac came in and realized that he'd been tricked out of this blessing, he vowed to kill him. Now, when I approach this story, there's a number of questions that just keep begging for an answer. What in the world, first of all, drove Jacob to practice such a stunt? I mean, he certainly knew that his brother would hate him when he found out that he had been tricked. And Jacob certainly understood that that expose of the trickery would happen within minutes as soon as Esau got back from the hunt to get the food he was after. And so within minutes, all of this would be exposed. You don't transfer wealth to one son from one son to the next in a matter of minutes. And the truth is that if Isaac, as soon as he realized he'd been tricked, if he indeed wanted to give the lion's share of the inheritance to Esau, he would have given it to Esau. This dressing up charade, what does that mean? It's a foolish kind of a thing. So why in the world did Jacob do the whole dress up thing? Well, I think it was because, more than anything else, Jacob wanted to hear from his father's own lips that he mattered to his dad, that he was loved and delighted in him. Jacob wanted to hear that word so badly that even if he had to hear it under pretense, even if he had to hear it to risk everything, he was willing to do that. Because every son desperately wants to hear that sort of a thing from their father. Every person on earth wants someone to say to them that they matter to them, from the depths of their being, that they count with them, that they count. And that's one of the things that dads here today can do to their kids. In fact, on this Father's Day, once you get that proverbial tie or whatever your child's going to give you, instead of just pretending it's a surprise, how about instead grabbing them by the shoulders, looking into their eyes, and dad saying something like this: "Not often enough do I say this to you, but you matter to me. And I am so proud of the kind of person you're becoming. And I am honored to be your father." Do you know how that will make your child's heart sing? But Jacob never heard that from his dad. It was always about Esau. And because he so desperately wanted to hear it, he was willing to go to all this charade and shenanigans to hear it even under false pretense. But he never got that kind of blessing from his dad. And so he looked elsewhere for that blessing, the real blessing. So he goes off to another country and he meets this gal by the name of Rachel. And Rachel is beautiful. And he says to himself, if only I could have Rachel for my wife, then I would feel that sense of blessing. Then I would know that my life is complete. Then I would know that I'm valuable and meaningful and have a sense of purpose. So he goes, finds Rachel, does win her, but then he realizes that there's still something missing. And the fact that he had placed so much of his value and his desire to be loved and his desire to find someone that would tell him he was worthwhile and cared for no matter what, because he placed so much of his eggs in the basket of Rachel, what happened was that he gave far too much value and emphasis to her and her children, he begins to favor the children of Rachel just the way that his father had favored Esau. And that favoritism in Jacob's life ends up poisoning the family system and leads to heartache among those 12 boys and a rivalry that takes decades and several trips to Egypt to get sorted out. You see, Jacob has been searching all his life for a blessing. He has wrestled with Isaac. We're told he wrestled with his twin brother Isaac while they were still in the womb. He tussles with his father to win that blessing. He wrestles with Uncle Laban to get it. All his life, he is looking for this blessing, someone that will fill that empty space in his life. His father doesn't provide it. Rachel won't provide it. None of the kids provide it. He's still empty. And one night he's alone. When on the side of that bank of that river, a mysterious person jumps him. And for hours, they wrestle. But as the night goes on, as Jacob wonders, who is this that I'm wrestling with? 3 clues begin to emerge to help us to identify the wrestler. The first clue is found in verse 25. It says, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with a man. Later on, we're going to learn that Jacob's hip was yanked so violently that he walked with a limp the rest of his life. But the verse doesn't say that the night wrestler yanked his leg. The verse doesn't say that the night wrestler smashed or struck his leg. It says that the night wrestler touched the socket of his hip. What must it have been like for Jacob to see this mysterious wrestler's finger reach out and go bing, and his hip is violently dislocated, and suddenly he realizes that whoever this person is he's wrestling with, he is of enormous power, and he has just been holding it back. That was the first clue. The second clue is found in verse 26. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." You don't want to see me, the stranger says, when the sun comes up. And Jacob takes the hint. In fact, he alludes to it in verse 30. Because Jacob knows that no human could look on the face of God in the full light of day and live. That's the second clue. The third clue is almost a comical one, where Jacob says, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" So one of the many things that after almost 40 years of marriage, one of the many things that troubles my wife that I constantly am doing is asking obvious questions. Questions that I ought to know the answer to without even asking. This is an obvious question here. Why do you ask my name? Didn't you see how I just touched your socket and dislocated your hip? Didn't you hear me when I said you don't want me to be around when the sun comes up because you know you can't look at the glory of the divine in full bright light? Why are you asking my name? Who else could I be? It's God that Jacob is wrestling with. And the sun's about to come up. And any rational human being would have said, the sun's almost here. Let me go. I'm too young to die. But let me suggest it's at that moment that Jacob's whole life changed. Because instead of doing the safe thing, instead of doing the easy thing, instead of doing the rational thing and letting him go as he had demanded, instead, Jacob takes hold of him in a new way and says, I won't let you go, at least not for now, because now I have finally figured it out. I've been spending my whole life looking to be blessed, first by my father, then by my wife, then by my kids. After spending all my life wrestling with people to get from them what I've always longed for, now finally, I realize that the thing I have been searching for my whole life is you, God. It's your blessing that I have always wanted. It's your approval. It's your love. It's your saying I'm all right. You're the one that I want to know. You're the one whose purpose I want to discover. You're the one that finally I need. Not my father, not my wife, not the kids. You, Lord. I want your love, your approval. I want your blessing. And so when Jacob says, I won't let you go, do you know what he's saying? He's saying, I don't care anymore. If the sun comes up and I'm struck dead in the full light of your glory, I want you. If that's the price that has to be paid, I'm ready to pay it. You're the one I've been looking for my whole life, and now I'm not going to let go of you. That's verse 26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. By the way, that's the second mark when you meet the real God. See, it's one thing, again, to believe in God. It's one thing to obey God. It's one thing to go to church all your life. But when you meet the real God, you realize that God is your life. In fact, that's the second blank. When you meet the real God, you realize He's the one you've been searching for. And when you realize that God is your life, that doesn't mean everything goes fine forevermore without any issues or problems in life. There's still questions, all kinds of questions you have about why these things happen, why this doesn't happen. But what you realize when God is your life, that you have the one thing you really need, God Himself. And all the other things will sort themselves out as things go on. Now, remember that this is a wrestling match, right? So here's a question for you. Who wins the match? Who wins the match? Now, any of you that have wrestled as a sport know that wrestling can be, there's not any nice, easy way to say it, can be agony at times. In every other sport, it seems, you use some of your muscles some of the time. But in wrestling, you use every muscle all the time. Every single muscle, every single bone is pressing against the corresponding muscle and bone of your opponent. And those 2 or 3 minutes of wrestling are sheer agony and exhausting. In fact, it's hard to imagine. Really, it's hard to imagine how this wrestling match could go on all night long. The question is, why did God do this? I mean, He knew what Jacob was looking for. Why didn't He just come to him in the night and say, look, Jacob, let me explain what you've been searching for all your life, your meaning for life, and let's save both of us a whole lot of trouble. You're not looking for Rachel. You don't want your dad's approval at the heart. What you need and what you're looking for is me. Why didn't God just say that? Well, maybe it's just me, but almost all the things that I've learned in life that matter of any significance, I've learned by being disappointed or being frustrated or going through the agony of realizing that I've been trying to get the answers in all the wrong places, that only God can give me what I'm searching for. I haven't learned that stuff listening to a sermon or reading a book. The only way you learn that God alone is the source of blessing that you're looking for, is the strain and the struggle and the agony of wrestling with him. That's just how we mortals live, it seems. And that's why in this match, Jacob wins. He sees that finally. After the night of wrestling, he gets the blessing. But when he says, I won't let you go until you bless me, by saying that, he gets the win, but he also admits that he spent his whole life looking in all the wrong places, all the wrong people to find that value. And so Jacob wins by losing, by admitting his weakness, his foolishness. He wins by repenting of seeking this in all the wrong places. God says you have overcome because you've admitted that you've been an utter failure. And that's what's talked about in verse 29. Then he blessed them there. Now, a blessing's always a verbal kind of a thing. So what do you suppose God actually said to Jacob in the middle of that night in the dark? Well, we're not told, but it had to have been something along the lines of, Jacob, I love and delight in you more than anything in the world. I long for you to see yourself the way I see you, to receive this immense gift of blessing and forgiveness and salvation. We all long to hear that from someone. Generally, we look to our fathers, our mothers, our wives, our husbands. But those people are just people. And when you finally realize that it's God that's saying that to you, that's the blessing that forever changes you. And yet, for the rest of his life, Jacob limped. He was blessed, but he limped. And I can't really think of a more emblematic portrayal of what our lives as Christians is like. We are blessed, and yet we limp. We continue to realize we're sinful, but we're loved. We find ourselves filled with humility and yet boldness because we realize that our identity is not tied to always having to be right. Our identity is not tied up in the fact that everything has to go well for us all the time. That's what it means to meet the real God, and that's the third blank. When you meet the real God, you win by losing. But I want to suggest to you, it wasn't just Jacob that night who won by losing. Believe it or not, it was actually God himself who also won by losing. Won by and won through his own weakness. How? Do you realize what God had to do to save and to bless Jacob? When it comes to wrestling, you probably know that you're only allowed to wrestle with someone in your own weight class. Because if an opponent is 15 or 20 pounds heavier than you, it's not a fair match. So let me just ask this question. How much does God weigh? What weight class do you think we ought to put him in? With all of his omnipotence and power, what kind of weight will you give him? Yet we're told, verse 25, when the man saw, that's God, that he could not overpower him. How could it be that the omnipotent, all-powerful creator of everything somehow is not able to overcome this human he's wrestling with? Well, it's because God had voluntarily held himself back. He had curbed his incredible power. He had chosen to be weak, so he wouldn't crush Jacob, but instead would bless him. Now, why would God really want to bless this man in the first place? I mean, if you actually read the entire story of Jacob, you discover he's just nothing but a shyster. He's a schemer, a deceiver. You read the book, the story of Abraham and Sarah that we've looked at the last couple of weeks, and while they do some foolish things, there's something in them that's also admirable at times. But when you look at the life of Jacob, it almost would be right to put stupid all across the front of his head. Everything he does is foolishness. And yet, how can a just God, bless someone like that? It's true that God voluntarily made himself weak, but why would he do that? Well, I'll tell you why. In the darkness of that moment, by that stream, God feigned weakness to bring salvation. Centuries later, in the darkness of Calvary, in the person of Jesus Christ, God literally became weak in order to bring salvation. Because there on a cross, the full weight of judgment came crashing down on Christ, crushing him. The full weight that Jacob deserved came down on Jesus. That's why the prophet Isaiah would later write, he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds, we are healed. You see, as Jesus began to feel the immense weight coming down on him those last days of his life, and it really began, at least explicitly, in the Garden of Gethsemane, what Jesus didn't say is, "Look, God, I am out of here." No, we're told Jesus held on. Why? Well, Jacob held on at the risk of his life to get the blessing for himself. But Jesus held on at the cost of his life to get the blessing to us. That's why Jesus did that. And that's why when we look at Jacob's life, we see a man who has met the real God. Have you met him? Have you met him alone? Have you met him recognizing only he can give you the blessing you're looking for? Have you met him at your point of not strength, but weakness? When you meet him there, that's when you know you've met the real God.